Two. Hey guys, Kid here, Burn1 with the Shadowverse Evolved channel, bringing you another deck profile. This time on Elephant Forest for Cosmic Mythos, but for the first time, I don't remember, but Shepard's here to introduce the deck and do the deck profile with me.
What's everybody? Yeah, this is my first time doing a deck profile. You might remember me as having the 100% correct takes in the set list as well as the tier list video.
Absolutely. So you want to do a quick summary of this deck before we jump into it?
Yeah, I think this is a really exciting deck to talk about. It's going to be one that, whether you want to play it or play against it, it's really important to know how it works. Brief overview is your plan is to, in the first 6-7 turns of the game, establish a board presence, keep kicking the tempo back to your opponent, right? You play 1 card to 2 card answers that put pressure and also buy you time. Somewhere in there, you're going to do anywhere from like 5 to 12 chip damage. And then once you get to turn 6 plus, every single turn, you're threatening to win the game with Silver Bolt, similar to last set, or this new card, which we'll get to in a minute, called King Elephant.
All right, with that being said, we'll jump right into the deck itself. All right, so here's the deck itself. We'll just kick it over to Shepard.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so let's just jump right into it. I described the game plan just a moment ago, and what I really like about this deck this set is that the way it's constructed, and this is the build that I'm on right now, every single card is both really good on its own and also contributes to that game plan. So we can just kick it off with Bellbringer Angel. Big part of this deck is you need to have a certain amount of 1-drops. Basically, every single game, you almost always need to have a 1-drop on 1 because you want to have access to benefiting from your bounce effects on 2. You want to be able to activate combo later in the game. So we're running 3 Bellbringers. It's just way better than the next best thing we could run in this strategy. If we wanted to be more aggressive, we would be on something like a Shinko Windy. But as I mentioned before, a big part of this deck strategy is actually conserving your hand size for cards like Cassiopeia, King Elephant, Silverbolt. Bellbringer is a great card because it does everything that we just described. It can potentially 2-for-1 you with its Evo by shooting something and then drawing you a card. It can create awkward turns. I mean, I don't have to describe too much about why this card is good because it's going to be in like 90% of the deck profiles. But in this case, for this deck, the fact that it's not only a good generic card, it's a 1-drop, earns it its place as the literal only neutral card in the deck. Next up is Elfchild May. This has been an all-star for a while. If you've been playing the game, you understand its power. With a card like Ancient Elf, it's going to be doing 4 to 5 damage to something on the opposing field. It can be anti-aggro. There's a lot of matchups where just having access to this card swings them dramatically in your favor, and you're pretty much going to want to draw at least 1 in most of the games you play. Sakuna, this is a new card that we'll need to really see the Evo to talk about. But what makes this powerful is that going second, it can come down on 1 as a 2/2 with Storm to get in some of that chip damage. And with this strategy against a lot of matchups where you're not going to be getting to the ultra late game, it's really important to get that chip damage in. But then later on in the game, you can build these win conditions. All right, here's the Evo card, perfect. Where you're turning it into a 3/3, a 5/5, or even buffing its attack with Spring Green Protection, another card we're going to get to. And this is what's going to help you find a lot of lethals. It's going to do the first set of work to get your opponent low, and then King Elephant can come in later and clean up. Or alternatively, if you've just done a good job of maintaining board presence over the game, it itself can be a finisher. I've probably won maybe 1 out of 6 games just with Sakuna as a 5/5. Nature's Guidance, this is just an all-star enabler. We have a lot of fanfare effects. We have a lot of things that care about leaving the battlefield, and it draws you a card. There's just not much more to say about it other than it's just a huge synergy piece, especially with this next card, Harvest Festival. This card's still an all-star. This card still rules. Basically, this is what helps enable you to keep a hand size, especially in combination with bounce effects, so you can keep bouncing it to keep drawing cards. Funny enough, especially in this current metagame and how Set 4 is playing out, the healing's actually really relevant. One of my favorite parts about this game is that in this late game scenarios against Egg Haven, which is another dominant deck, you actually end up using this card to crack just to put yourself out of different ranges, because that's a deck whose one of their primary win conditions is to do 2 damage to you at a time. So every odd life total you get basically can buy you one more resource, one more turn against them. Spring Green Protection. This is a really exciting new card that enables a really powerful synergy with the next card we're going to talk about. Important to note is that when this card leaves the battlefield, you get a 0 cost token. So then on any future turn, you can use that as a combo enabler for itself or other cards. Also very relevant is it can give a follower +1 attack, which can help you do things like find an extra lethal with Sakuna, or clear something you couldn't clear otherwise, or in some cases just buff something slightly out of range. Turning a 5/5 into a 6/6, for example, makes it a lot harder for your opponent to deal with. Ancient Elf, the set 1 legendary, combos with every single 1-drop that came before it, and most importantly with Spring Green Protection. Going second, you can now create a 5/5 on turn 2 by playing Spring Green Protection on 1. On turn 2, play Ancient Elf, return Spring Green Protection. Then you play the Wisp, and then you spend the Evo point to evolve it. Evolving it returns the Wisp. Now you have a 5/5. In a lot of games you play, you will do that, and if your opponent can't answer it, they are realistically virtually never winning that game. Otherwise, it's just a really powerful card. Crystalia Tia, you might notice this is our first 2 of. We're mostly on 3 ofs in this list. We love consistency. The thing with Tia is you typically don't want to draw too many of her, especially because we are trying to conserve hand size. But she is really powerful. The evolve is not as important on her, but what she does is just let you take a couple of actions and build a board that's really frustrating for your opponent. We play 1 Evo because, like I mentioned before, it's not critical to Evo her, but there are going to be certain boards where giving the 5/5 rush or even being able to swing in with the 2/2 to kill a Bellringer is going to be really relevant. Marvelous Sunday is something that we actually still really value, just because, as I mentioned, in some matchups like Egg Haven, the healing is phenomenal. 2/3 with this beneficial effect is a really important body in a lot of matchups, especially against any kind of aggressive strategy. And a lot of the games that you play, you're going to want to play any of our 1-drops on 1, followed by Marvelous Sunday on 2, and you're going to feel good about it. Bellringer is definitely the worst because you don't get a benefit for bouncing it, but every single one of our other 1-drops will get some kind of value for bouncing it in addition to gaining the 2 life. Okay, this is going to be a bit of a controversial pick here because this is a card that is in many ways isometric to Rose Gardener, except for a couple of key differences. So I'm going to go over why we play Ice and Flash. For those of you that might be new to the game, Ice and Flash and Rose Gardener both have the effect of essentially paying a play point to give them +1/+1 and then returning an enemy follower to hand. The difference is Ice and Flash races, which means that we have carrots instead of Evos, which we can use for our Marvelous Sundays, right? Now we have access to Racing Marvelous Sunday, which can be really relevant to clear certain boards, get past Bellringers on lethal turns, etc. What's also important is there's a lot of Surefire bullets running around, and Surefire bullet actually won't kill Ice and Flash because she's not evolved, so it only do 3 damage to her. That's why we prefer it, just because Rose Gardener, the combo 3 isn't going to come up as much, especially in a deck like this, where most of the turns outside of specific combo turns and maybe turn 4 for Tia, you're not going to be playing a bunch of cards in the same turn like you might expect. One other note here, part of the game plan is this tempo-y strategy. So putting down a 4/4, leaving it standing, and your opponent has no board. Now on their turn, you pass it back. They have to choose a lot of the time whether they want to develop their board or if they want to answer this and then play a smaller threat. If they choose to do the latter, you feel good. If you choose to do the former, you feel good because then you get to swing for 4 and then you spend your mana answering their board again. This might seem a little bit weird because I know I just mentioned we don't do too many combo turns in this deck, but this card I think is really important. It's a 1-of, could potentially be a 2-of, cutting maybe like a Rose Deer or something like that, depending on your meta, but its main role is that it's going to get past a lot of obstacles like opposing Ancient Elves. It just gives a couple of outs versus specific meta threats. And then most importantly, through a combination of Wisps or a 1-drop here and there, you're going to, when you can, try and get that 3 damage in because it is going to be really relevant. Like I said, this is a deck that really wants to get some chip damage in the first 5 turns, and this is just another way to get that chip damage in. Rose Deer. This card has been a wild journey for us in testing, as going, hey, this isn't really good enough in set 4. Now I run it as a 3-of. I think a lot of the better strategies in this set excluding Egghaven, slow down, and they focus on healing. And what Rose Deer does is against a lot of the decks, whether it's Control Abyss or Control Haven or Ramp Dragon, so it gives you a lot of longevity because it creates 2 threats. It helps you maintain your hand size, and you can always bounce it. So a really important play to know in this deck is when you are going against a strategy that wants to go to the late game and will force force you to do a lot more damage because they have a lot more healing. Doing something like turn 5, play a Rose Deer, bounce the Rose Deer with Nature's Guidance might seem tempo negative, but it could be a really vital play because getting that second Thorn Burst is going to make the difference between winning and losing that game. Also, as I keep saying, this deck really wants to get in chip damage so it can finish off with Elephant on 6. Yes, Elephant on 10 can do 18 plus damage, but you really don't want to do that. You want to end the game before turn 8, and just getting this other source of 3 damage in is really huge. Cassiopeia, I would say this is one of the most defining pieces of Forest moving forward. A lot of people play this card and say, okay, I need to do this, this, and this in my deck. The truth is, our deck doesn't need to do a lot of work to make Cassiopeia good. We don't play too many things that intentionally put stuff in the EX area. We just have a game plan that is focused on playing only a few cards a turn. We're not dumping our hand. Cassiopeia is going to come down and do anywhere from 4 to 8 damage on 5. And that's devastating for your opponent. She basically is a 4 or 5 that can answer most boards, or at least answer most of the threats on most boards on 5, and then leave a standing 4 or 5. 5 health on 5 is relevant. There's a lot of crafts that can deal with 5 health, but it does cost them a significant amount of mana. Generally speaking, your opponent has to spend at least 3 mana to deal with this card. If you play it on turn 5, they go to their turn, they're going to spend 3 of their 5 or 3 of their 6 mana dealing with this card, which gives you a huge mana advantage, especially because you've cleared their board with it. A lot of the times this card will live and then get in that 4 chip damage, which can't stress enough how important that is.
I'd like to add too, like for my playtesting as well, like you can accidentally too just get up to like double-digit burn damage just from having wisps and like thorn burst in your EX area from just naturally playing the game over time and not developing those wisps sometimes. So
yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, I think people really underestimate how much damage this does, especially once again, it's on game plan. We don't dump our hand. Turn 5, I realistically can do 7 damage with this most of the games I play, especially because Rose Deer on 4, add a Thorn Burst, play this on 5. It answers and gets you out of just an insane amount of situations that you wouldn't otherwise have access to, whether that's many small threats from your opponent or a couple of big threats, like one big creature follower. It can chew through that. I've seen people say, oh, you only need to run 2. You don't want to have them clog up your hand. I fundamentally disagree. I think this is one of the best cards to draw 2 of. Yeah, you kind of need to survive to this point, but look at the rest of the deck. We mostly play these lower cost cards, right? Look at how many 1-drops and 2-drops we're on. Most of the time, we're going to have hands that are very playable. If you go turn 5 Cassiopeia, wipe the opponent's board, and let's say through some combination of voodoo, they kill your Cassiopeia and then remake a board, what could be better than doing it again and making them have to make that magic happen twice, right? How many hands does your opponent have that can survive the second Cassiopeia? At that point, you don't even need to elephant. You've just taken such an advantage that you control that game.
Yeah.
All right, this is the big boy. This is the deck name. I've referenced this card a lot, so I'm sorry if you're new and you don't know what it does. We're going to go over it. Basically, it comes down, it has Storm, and you pick up any of your other cards that you want and put them in your hand. And then it gets bigger based on your hand size. A defining fact of the playstyle we're going for, where we're not dumping our hand, is that we want to make this card more powerful and more of a threat. Oftentimes, this card is the card you play to win the game, whether it's on 6 or it's on 7 or it's on 8. This is what's going to be getting in that last 8, 9, 10 damage, potentially even more. Oftentimes, you'll play it when it's not lethal, especially if you have a second one, because it gets to be really big, and then while the evolve costs 4, it's so threatening that your opponent has to deal with this 8/8, and then if they don't, even if they can heal up, well, it's going to do it again. It's going to go to be a 16/16 or a 15/15, and it also gives us inevitability. So let's say we're not able to close out the game in certain matchups, like against a Ramp Dragon. It basically gives us access on turn 9 going second or turn 10 going first to, hey, I'm just going to put a 15/15 ignores ward into play. That's a huge threat. That's going to redefine the way every opponent has to play into you. And you can take advantage of that, right? You don't even have to have this card in your hand if you're playing against a player who's good. And don't try this against players that are not good, because you can't bluff players that don't know what they're expecting. You can just continually set up board states that your opponent has to play around, knowing this card could come, right? And that's what gives you a lot of the power of this deck. Is your opponent always is sweating and thinking about, like, you have the super forte that could come down at any time. Couple of important play things to note with this: if you're going second, you, depending on the matchup, really want to save your last evo point. So try to conserve it, because it lets you play King Elephant a turn earlier in the late game if you think the game's going to get to that point. Another thing to note is that if you return Harvest Festival with King Elephant on the front side when you bounce all your cards, it won't count the card you draw from Harvest Festival because you finish resolving the effect, then you draw the card. However, let's say that you play it and evolve it, the second half, when you evolve it, will count the card you draw from Harvest Festival. So you want to be constantly doing this math of, okay, I'm going to play out a couple Harvest Festivals this turn, knowing that next turn I'm going to King Elephant to return them to my hand so I can reach this extra lethal threshold I didn't have before. That's kind of in the weeds, but the more you play with this card, the more you're going to see that there's a lot of plays like that you have. In general, I think an undervalued part of this card is that when you play it on 6 for non-lethal, being able to pick up cards is kind of crazy. Like if you can pick up a Cassiopeia, a Rose Deer, a couple of things, and just get a little bit of extra value, it feels even better. Lastly, we're on 1 Silverbolt. Might seem a little bit weird that we're on 1. I understand some people run 2. I want to try running 2 at some point, but the problem is that's actually a deck clog issue, where as opposed to running extra 5-cost Cassiopeias, this is a 7-cost card that you never really want to play if you're not going to win the game this turn, or your opponent's not threatening you and you're going to win the game next turn, right? But what this does is gives us access to another elephant in the deck that does not care about wards, does not care about anything. It is a little bit worse than elephant because it doesn't threaten the Evo and it doesn't stay on the board. It just gives us that little bit of extra reach, and in a lot of the games you draw it, that's going to be exactly enough. There's also a surprise factor where not every deck is running it. And so some players aren't going to play around it, or some players are going to be in situations where they feel like they can't play around it, so they don't. And that's when they're so stressed about this elephant that you just Silverbolt them out of the game.
Yeah, exactly. One of the big things too from testing over this past weekend, this list, was there's a couple times too where you King Elephant on 6, you don't actually end the game there, but like you have this big body they have to deal with, and they spend all their time dealing with this body, and then they pass back to you and you just go, yeah, Silverbolt for game, and you present the handshake.
Exactly. And there's one more thing I want to say, which is that King Elephant as a win con at 3 of, we have a 40 card deck size, and this is a deck that you're going to see a lot of cards every game just because you have a lot of ways to cycle through your deck. That said, there's always the world, and this will happen, and this will happen in big events, this will happen in Top Cut. Your elephants will be deep in the deck. They will be in the bottom 10 cards. Statistically, it's just a thing that exists. Playing a 4th win condition just reduces your variance by that much, because now there's a percentage of games that you were never going to find a win condition, but now you've increased and added in this sample of games where you never draw the elephant, but you do draw a win condition because you have access to Silverbolt.
Yeah, exactly. I think you summed up everything very great with this deck. What would you say, like, some of the bad matchups and good matchups for the deck?
Yeah, I think for this build specifically, I don't know if I would say it has any horrendous matchups to look out for. I think one of the things I like about it is that you have a lot of game against everybody. Some of the things that I will say is against Egg Haven specifically, there are some draws where you are just a dog to them, and there are some draws where they are just a dog to you, and that's a highly volatile matchup that takes a lot of reps. And I would recommend that if you plan on bringing this to an event, that you grind against Egg Haven a lot to understand it. I would say if you are on, I'm not sure if you showcased the version of Ramp Dragon yet on the channel that features a lot of the healing kit. Yeah. That is a list that is very threatening. I would say that most Ramp Dragon lists, I don't think are playing what I would play, but if you were playing the Ramp Dragon list I would play, you have a good matchup into this deck. just because you heal so much, you clear the board so much, and you can answer a lot of the annoying things. The last thing I'll call out is that while I think this deck is favored against them, strategies that feature Executioner can be really frustrating because they can rip Elephant out of your hand. And lastly, you have to play differently when you see Abyss, because if they're threatening any kind of Death's Ward deck, you really need to prioritize keeping your instant flashes in hand. You don't want to run those out early, even if it's the cost of tempo, because it's going to be really important that when they Israfil or when they bring back, Azazel or whoever it is, with a Death's Ward, is that the name of the card?
Death's Breath.
Death's Breath. Not Azazel, but the other one, the 7-drop, the Lelouch. You want to be able to return that to their hand and put the tempo back to them. Sure, they can get more battle cry. Sure, they can heal off the Israfil. But what you're doing is you're just kind of de-warding, because you're taking away the ward that it got from Death's Breath, and also making them have to respend all that mana on a future turn. I know that's not a matchup question. That's just another thing I wanted to call out, because the way this deck plays is that if you know how to play into each matchup, you can do it. One other call out is Hero Sword. Is you really have to mulligan specifically against Hero Sword. You really have to look for your anti-aggro tools, and you really need to put the pressure down. It might seem like this deck is going to have the late game against Hero Sword, but it's going to be a problem when Hero Sword builds 2 turns of boards in a row. Cassiopeia is a really key card of that matchup for that reason, is it can undo a big Amaro turn, basically single-handedly. But outside of that, you don't have a lot of options to clear the board. So you actually have to take a lot of aggressive lines against Hero, and that can be probably a slightly favored matchup. Last thing is this deck is a little bit built to have game against Uma. I think if you play other versions of this deck, you're going to have a worse time. But Uma plays a lot of standing threats right now. So we play a lot of threats that are standing into it. I'm trying to think of any other specific matchup callouts. I think this has pretty much really good game. I think it's at least 50 to 60% against almost the entire field. That's part of what just makes it one of the best decks. It just can be a little draw dependent. Yeah,
I think the last thing I'm going to ask here, because I'm sure this will come up in the comments at some point, why no Suzuka?
Yeah, I think that's a really fair question. I would like to fit in a Suzuka if I could. There's just a couple of problems with it, which is that the Evo deck is really tight. That third carrot might seem like it's a stretch. It might seem like it's really easy to cut a carrot. It's not. Like, the racing the Marvelous Sundays and having access to all the flashes comes up a lot, and I really value that a lot more than Silent Suzuka. The other thing is this deck has a really clean curve in terms of how many 1-drops, how many other things you get, and it'd be hard to introduce Silent Suzuka without disrupting that. And the real answer is that it just doesn't need it. You play this list, if you're not a believer, go play this list for 4 or 5 games and you'll see. Very rarely do you think to yourself, Silent Suzuka could have won or lost me this game, because that's just not how the games play out.
Yep, I'd have to agree across the board. I played this list over the weekend, and literally the only game I lost was the one where all 3 King Elephants were like in the bottom 10 cards of my deck. I was digging so hard, and I was just like, where's this King Elephant? Like, I have lethal, I'm ready. It just never came up.
Games like that almost make you like want to play the second Silverbolt, so you have 5 win conditions in your deck. If you are interested in changing this deck at all, I would say the real flex spots that you have to move around are the Ivy Spell Bombs, the Rose Deers, and potentially the Sukunas. That's where you can find flexibility. I wouldn't cut the Sukunas personally, but I think that somewhere between the 3 Rose Deer and the 1 Ivy Spell Bomb, if you want to take those 4 slots and rearrange them to customize this, feel free, because that's where I think there's the room, right? I think based on the meta, I could totally see myself coming down from 3 Rose Deer. I just think that is like I said, that's going to come down to the meta. If every single deck you play against this sword, those Rose Deers are going to feel a lot worse. And then maybe you want to run a different card, a more anti-aggro card in that place.
Yep, I'd have to agree. Sukuna actually became one of my favorite cards in this list after playing it a lot. Sukuna's been really, really good. But yeah, I think that kind of wraps up everything. You did, you explained like everything super well. So hopefully this is very informative for everyone and everyone gets a lot of knowledge from this.
Yeah, it's kind of painful. You know, I spent over a month playtesting pre-release, and this is the list I came up with, and now it's released into the world. So I hope you guys enjoy it as much as I have.
All right, with that being said, thank you guys for watching. Hopefully we'll see you guys in the next video. Later.